Hey everyone, this is Nate McGackey. I am Executive Director of Arts North Carolina, and I want to welcome you all to the webinar this morning, Fundraising in a Time of Crisis for the Performing Arts. We are so thankful to be able to get this information and this content out, particularly from Robert Sweeney Consulting, who's providing all of this fantastic training to us free of charge. For those of you that aren't familiar, Robert Sweeney Consulting is a national fundraising consulting firm focusing on the arts and cultural organizations. Their fundamental approach is effective for any size market or institution, and they have a comprehensive array of services that are customized to each of their clients' needs. So they really do understand the total breadth of the conversation we're having in the arts here in North Carolina. Joining us today from RSC is Bob Sweeney, the founder and CEO. He founded Robert Sweeney Consulting in 2006. He is a very highly sought after authority on fundraising and growth of fundraising, and himself has a 30-year career in fundraising for the arts. We are also joined by Kat Heitz-New, who is a project consultant with RSC. She is also a former Arts North Carolina board member, so we know her very well. She is an accomplished nonprofit leader with more than 15 years of experience. She helped raise more than $75 million at the Arts Council of Winston-Salem and Forsyth County, and has a breadth of experience that extends beyond arts organizations, including colleges and community foundations. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Bob and Kat and let them inform and entertain everyone. So thank you guys so very much for this.
Nate, thank you. This is Bob, and thanks to you and Christine both for helping us set this up. Thanks, of course, to Arts North Carolina, and thanks everybody for joining in. There are probably fewer compelling titles than something that contains the word crisis, particularly when it's involving fundraising. But we're really glad that we're able to help in this way. We know that everyone's in a similar situation right now, and we've spent a little bit of time over the last few weeks doing seminars like this, and also spending lots of time on the phones and video conferences and learning at the same time that we're teaching. And so we want to do a little bit of that today as well. We're going to take you through what we've learned in terms of best practices and how that overlays with a crisis situation. But for those of you who are not as familiar with our company, we are based in Indianapolis, but we have offices here and there scattered throughout the country. We're focused on arts and culture, as Nate said. We've been doing this since 2006, working mostly with performing arts, but not exclusively. And because of my background, working with quite a bit of orchestras. So we are deep in the middle of feeling your pain with what's happening right now. So we're grateful again for the opportunity. And for those of you who don't know Kat, she is my partner in crime and sidekick on this today. And I'll just have her introduce herself real quickly for those of you who may not know her. Kat?
Sure. Well, I'm glad I saw that many of my friends from my Arts Council and my North Carolina days are on the call today. So welcome to you all. I'm glad to have you and many others with us. I've been with the firm for about 4 years, full-time for 2, and working with a breadth of organizations, really ranging from budget size of $1 million up to $60 million plus. So it's been an exciting time to work with these groups as we think through the creative, the proactive strategies for response to this current environment.
Great, thank you, Kat. And I agree. Right now it is a great thing to have creative minds working creatively to solve these problems. I know that we'll bring some things to the table. We'll have a Q&A session at the end of this, so that if you have questions or if you have things to offer in terms of what you've heard, we're happy to put some of those up there. If we don't have time for everything, we'll get to as much as we can today. But really focused on today's webinar, we're gonna look at RSC's best practices. That's fundraising for the arts, We'll take you through the whole table and work on that today. The description of our donor cycle, and it's adapted during this pandemic period since we can't see our patrons and can't interact with them in the same ways. How we think that you can strengthen relationships over these next 18 months, even though the next 18 months still have quite a bit of unpredictability associated with it. We'll do fundraising options going into 2021, and then we'll do the Q&A. We realize that not everybody on this session today is from a performing arts organization, or that's your sole purpose. Most of what we'll talk about will relate directly to that. So what we'll say is, because this is a brief webinar, take what we're saying and adapt it to your own organization as we kind of go through this. You'll know yours much better than ours. So crisis fundraising best practices. Here are some things that we found out. By no means is this an exhaustive list, but places where we're telling our clients where they should focus. We tell them first and foremost to focus on what they can control and what they can influence. There are so many variables right now of things that we cannot control. And some organizations, I think to their detriment, are spending an enormous amount of time trying to control things that they cannot even define the issues, the problems, the dynamics of it. So there are plenty of things to work on that you can control and that you can influence. And we'll kind of go through some of those as well today. Keep the money is number two. Keeping the money in the current fiscal year is very important. Particularly for performing arts, because you don't know when you're going to be back of necessarily performing again, and you don't know what your patron base, what their comfort level will be to return. And so rather than kick that money into other areas, and we'll again talk about this a little bit more detail, but rather than push that money into future years and then have to make tough decisions, turning that money into annual fund money has become a really successful best practice. Creating value. So even if you're a small organization and if you cannot produce your own content to promote, you can certainly highlight other organizations' content and promote that as well, and stay in contact with your patron base and with your shareholders to make sure that they are both feeling fulfilled with what you're doing, that they feel connected with what you're doing, and that it makes sense to them that staying connected even when you're not live on stage or live in the community, it still can make some very good sense for them. Engaging the artists that you employ or that you contract, and certainly engaging the board in ways. And as we go through the donor cycle, we're going to talk about that just a little bit more. We say keep asking and keep stewarding. So continuing to ask for money is a best practice. And I know there's some hesitation out there with certain organizations who think that right now we should not, because not just of the virus, but also because of the stock market effects, and that it dipped down really quickly. Now it's kind of moving sideways and it's a little unpredictable. And so the initial onset is, the initial idea rather is to think maybe perhaps we shouldn't be soliciting and asking for support. And while I understand it, what we're finding is over and over again, it's just not the right instinct. And so to continue asking, continuing to steward, and then prepare for more fundraising in 2021. Again, we are, no one knows for sure, but what I'm estimating at this point is that contributed revenue will take over somewhere between 80 to 85% of the total operating budget. And so even if the operating budget goes down, that percentage is going to increase. So the idea of continuing to fundraise, continuing to create value, and communicating that, building relationships will be ultimately important, even if you're not out there performing the way that you're accustomed to. So we're a company of action. We do a lot of coaching in terms of how to raise more money. And we like immediate results just as much as the next person, and certainly as much as our partners. And so some of the things that we're saying, things that you can do right away that will continue to create interest, that can translate into philanthropic support. So as we said, creating and posting online content. If it's yours, great. If it's not, great. But just staying and posting it and staying in contact with folks. Always promote it. Always keep promoting. It's very difficult at this point to think about what level it means over contacting your patron base to keep them informed. And so we're saying, put it out there, Be as interactive as you can. Continue to communicate and update as much good news and high value as you possibly can. We say double down, number 3, on stewardship. We definitely want to reach out to all of our patrons, but really our very best donors, our very best sponsors, our board members, and it goes on and on like that. But this idea, and it's not always about checking in about the organization, particularly at first when the lockdown began, we were suggesting that our organization partners just reach out to their donors to do what we affectionately called a wellness check, just to see how people were doing and how are they dealing with, not being able to leave the house, and are they partaking of any of the art that we're putting out there, and do they know how to do it, and are they comfortable getting onto the web page or YouTube or Facebook and finding that. So it was just that sort of thing. That connection point, particularly in a time where most connections just stopped. Number 4 is continuing to ask for support. We're going to go into that. Actually, Kat's going to go into that in much greater detail as we get into this presentation. Engaging your artists and your board. Again, board are great at stewardship, making calls, thanking people. It's fantastic. Again, we'll touch on 2 or 3 more of those kind of opportunities. And if you have artists who are available and willing, posting information online, either performances or if they're presenting art in some way, or if it's Q&A, those things are great and it keeps folks engaged. And we say just kind of consider engaging a guide, particularly for fundraising. Doesn't always mean a consulting firm like ours, but it can mean a consulting firm like ours. Sometimes you'll have someone who's local, who understands the philanthropic landscape very well. But right now, while you're making so many other decisions in trying to keep your organization not just afloat, but producing good art and staying in contact, having someone who knows the efficiency and helps you not make mistakes in fundraising, and motivates your board and motivates your development committee and staff can really be of high value to you, particularly now. So then we have 6 actions we recommend you don't take. And the first one is needs-based fundraising. We're huge about case statements, big on case statements and being value added, not needs-based. Everybody needs the money right now. Everybody needs the money right now. So to position a case statement or an ask that says, we need the money is just noise, because it's reflective of everyone's sentiment right now. So we say create value, promote that value, and ask people to partner with you to support that value. And as much as you possibly can. We know different organizations have different capabilities, so don't try to overreach, but produce what you can. Number 2, require the board to fully fill a gap. That is a big no-no. It's an easy no-no, but right now, board members, like everybody else, are going through their own issues with their businesses and their families and their travel and all sorts of things. And while we want them to participate, we certainly don't want them to be the only ones who are participating and trying to fill any financial gap that you have. Don't disappear. We've talked about that enough already. But this idea that you just hunker down and don't do anything, don't tell anybody, and you just try to internally figure out the issue, hoping that you could reemerge as a changed organization or a healthy organization. It's just not realistic. And so don't disappear. Don't openly discuss bankruptcy. And I'm telling you, it's happened out there where there have been gift asks and gift requests and letters that have gone out that says primarily if you don't make your contribution soon, we might have to file for bankruptcy. It kind of goes back up to number 1, needs-based fundraising is a no-no. So, and number 5 is consider philanthropy as all in or all out affair. We have to be flexible. And as fundraisers, we have to be flexible. As organizations, we have to be flexible. Our patrons, again, are going through all sorts of things that we might have a sense of, but can't completely or clearly articulate. So if somebody usually gives in March and they can't give in March because of everything that's happened, but they'd like to give 2 split payments, let's be flexible. Let's even be suggesting with that kind of flexibility. Number 6 is relying too much on government money and loans for your organization's recovery. Listen, these programs are great. We've studied them. We've helped some of our clients apply for them. We understand it's fantastic, but to rely on that as being really your sole benefit right now during a terrible time is going to be counterproductive for you long term.
Yeah. And Bob, on that note, I just wanted to add as well that, setting that context with your board and your major donors, that the government and money and these loans can be a first step in the organization's response, but they are certainly not the only step in the organization's response and recovery.
That's right. All right, so those are 6 that you shouldn't. Again, not a comprehensive list, but just some things to think about. So message and frequency matter. Here are things that we are recommending over and over again. Keeping your message at what we call 30,000 feet. There are enough variables that are changing rapidly that what could be true today may not be true 2 days from now. And so to get into nitty gritty details as you're sending out updates or gift requests or what that it causes confusion. It has the potential at least to cause confusion. And we know that when patrons get confused, they usually stop supporting because they don't get it. So we want to help them continue to get it. And by that, we mean focus on a message, the elements of what your organization is doing, what it's moving towards, what it's dealing with. Stay up high with general comments that are not going to rapidly change or have cascading effects that you have to explain in detail. It's good to put the good and the bad both out there and the opportunities out there as well, but changing details up every few days will really confuse folks, and so we advise against that. Again, focusing activities, on your activities and the value of those activities, and communicating that through frequent messaging. We say, reinforce each disappointment with at least 2 positives, and we believe that. So if you have bad news to deliver, make sure there's some good news in there as well. And if you can deliver good news in a 2-to-1 ratio with disappointing news, it continues to keep people engaged. We do like to say become peddlers of hope. And I know the old saying, I'm familiar with the saying that hope is not a strategy. And while I believe that's true, I do believe hope right now is a tactic, and we should exploit it because we are the kind of organizations that can provide hope, that can provide inspiration, that can provide some real aspirational thinking of other people who partake in this. And so when they hear our performances or see our art or work with our organizations, it's okay that we're putting some hope out there because people need it, especially now. And it's one of the things that we can do really, really well. Mm-hmm. We talked about over communicating. Keep over communicating. If you feel like you've done as much as you can, double down and do some more and make it interactive when possible. And sometimes that's in the form of surveys. Sometimes that's in the form of if you're doing a Facebook Live. And, in the case of we deal with a lot of orchestras, and if somebody who's performing on violin says, okay, the next piece I can play this, or I can play this, everybody vote real quick, boom, and they play whatever gets the highest number of votes. And it's really so making it fun. Doesn't have to be important, but it can be fun and it can be interactive. And again, if you don't have those capabilities, it's okay. Just think about some of these other things that you can do in ways to communicate outward and to stay connected to your patron base. Yeah. So options for ticket money. And again, I know not everyone on here is with a performing arts organization. So what I'll say is that for those of you who are, there's what we call the big 4. What do you do with the money for concerts and performances that you've canceled or are going to cancel? And the big 4, of course, are exchange, into another performance, get a voucher that you can use later, turn that money into a contribution, or provide a refund. And that's the big R word. We try not to say that very often. There's a reason that it's last. But what we also believe is that you can, even though you have 4 options and maybe arguably more than that, but at least 4 options, they do not have to be equal. You don't have to present them equally. You can present them to the benefit of your organization now. What we'd really like to do is keep the money in this current fiscal year because that helps you. And it also then, as you do begin to perform, you're not moving money from one fiscal year to the next. If someone really wants to come to your performance and they've given you ticket money as an annual fund gift, they're going to buy again. They really are going to buy again. If there's something they want to see, they're going to come see it. And so we're comfortable in that tactic of having people turn it in as a philanthropic gift. They get a tax receipt. They certainly didn't get any goods or services for it. And once you're back up and running and performance schedule comes out and so forth, they can be engaged to become ticket purchasers yet again. That's why we emphasize the annual fund, and because your other sources of cash flow have either slowed or stopped. And we're seeing this with big organizations that we're working with, big group one orchestras, and we're seeing it with, $500,000 places that we're working with. And so the constant is that people continue to remain to be generous, and the annual fund can help support the budget and the operation and the vision of the institution. There is an advantage to canceling the remainder of the season rather than canceling concerts or performances or one-off. And that is, once you cancel everything, the annual fund option becomes much more logical and reasonable. Now, that doesn't mean that there are detriments as well. So all we wanted to point out was the potential advantage to this. You have to think about it very carefully as an institution, of course, and what's best for your organization. So this is our donor cycle that I mentioned earlier. And our donor cycle probably looks like a lot of other donor cycles, but this is the one that we use quite a bit as we're working with folks. And we talk about these areas of identifying donors, cultivating donors, soliciting donors, and then stewarding or appreciating them, and then further talking about does that donor eventually have another role in the organization. The ones we're going to focus on mostly today are the identification and the cultivation, appreciation, and solicitation, those areas. Cultivation and appreciation act very similarly, and even though they're on different sides of the solicitation itself. And then solicitation, although we deem it as most important, and it is, it actually takes the least amount of time when done well. Cultivation and appreciation take a lot more time, take a higher investment of thought and relationship development. Kat's going to talk about those kind of things as we move forward here in just a minute. But as what I would say on that entire cycle, it's critical, especially now, to give consistent attention to each step, to the identification, cultivation, solicitation, and appreciation of donors. It should be outward focused, full engagement. Again, it's not about your organization's needs. It's not about needs. It's not about needs. It's about value, value, value. What do we do for the community that nobody else can do in the way that we do it? Why is that important? Who do we do it for? What's that value? And then we create a communications plan. How often, how frequently do we communicate? What is it that we say over and over again that we want our patrons to remember, especially now in a critical time? What are the mutually beneficial value of the relationships that we build? So it's not just about what we need and what we can say, but what do our patrons need, and what do they say, and how do we listen well to them, and how do we respond? Then emphasis on cultivation and stewardship. Again, Kat's going to touch on that in a minute. And then customizing gift requests. Right now, we think more and more that you can do personal gift requests rather than sending letters. The more personal outreach you can do, the better off you and the organization and the patron will be for it. So I'll stop there and turn this over to Kat. She's going to take you through some different portions of giving segmentations, and just talk a little bit about the cultivation, stewardship, and then the solicitation portion. So Kat, take it away.
Wonderful. Well, and I just wanted to reemphasize something that Bob mentioned earlier in the presentation, and that is that we're hearing this lingering hesitation around being out in a proactive fundraising way in this time, just those questions of uncertainty, and want to note that nothing validates action like results. And so as we walk through the next few slides, these are tactics that we are working directly with clients to implement, and clients are seeing anywhere from $10 to $40 to $100,000 days as a result. So, wanted to set that context before we get into this, that the generosity that we see and the results from this kind of work is proven. So as we go through them, I'll set a little context as well for what we're about to talk about. We really take the entirety of the annual fund or the fundraising program, and we break it down into what we call key prospect segments. So what we'll talk about today are the board, premier individuals, or you may refer to them as major donors, Broad-based individuals typically are folks who are giving $1,000 or less to your annual fund. And then institutional, really also drilling down on grantors within that, those that maybe are making donations to you or grants to you that are restricted in some way or typically restricted. And so the reason that we'll break the work that we'll talk about down into those 4 categories is because the approach to each of them is bespoke. We know that what works with each one of them most effectively. And so we want to take you through that prospect segment by prospect segment. And so it's no surprise that we start with our board. Our board, with them, we know that on the cultivation and the stewardship, that relationship building side, that nothing motivates investment like personal involvement. So it's also no surprise that often we find our board members are among our top donors. So when we're thinking about how we cultivate and we steward these important investors in our organization at this moment, the main key is communication. So certainly that can be to the group as a whole, but we're really encouraging you to think about that as one-on-one as well, really based on their role and their skills. This is not a time to think that the board's got it and they are good to go. We really need to over-communicate with them. And that's because of their own personal investment, both as volunteers and donors to our organizations, but also because they're your voice in the community. They are your ambassadors of hope and confidence. And so we want to make sure that they are equipped and confident in your organizational message and response at this time. And remember that most importantly with them, as with all volunteers, that we have to recognize the good work they do, thank them often, thank them publicly. And that's the most important factor in them taking that good action again. So it's a feel good, but it's also the motivator for the next good thing that that board member will do for our organization. Bob, we can go on to the next slide. Great. So when we're talking about actually soliciting our board, as Bob mentioned, we should not think about the entirety of filling the gap to the goal as their sole responsibility, but they are the drivers. They are the pace setters for your success in meeting goals. And this is at any time, whether you're thinking about the annual fund or special efforts that you may be partaking in now as part of your response to the current environment. So when we talk about the board as a pace setter, our mantra should be that the board should give first and give strong, because their action to do so is actually driving the momentum for the balance of the fundraising. They're the core of our overall success and the pace setter for meeting the goal. And you can certainly further set the context for what their giving means. We love doing so via a challenge grant. What we typically see this playing out as is that new and increased gifts from the board are pulled into one large matching challenge that can then be turned out to the community. So it's a really tangible way, not only for them to understand how crucial their personal support is at this time, but also how it leverages additional support that the organization can garner beyond the board. So we love setting that context. And we know that many of you are on the cusp of a fiscal year turnover. So we are recommending with the board, and you'll see several of our other key segments, that with these that are closest to your organization, having that conversation about their giving now, as well as early commitments for the upcoming fiscal year. We've seen, many clients struggle with the idea of soliciting a board member or a major donor who typically gives maybe in the early fall or as a season starts in the next fiscal year, and questioning whether their support now is essentially precluding them from going back at that point. By making a comprehensive ask, you are circumventing any confusion and giving really a direct request to this prospect. We can hop over to the next slide. All right, so premier individual giving. Many of you also refer to this, and we as well, as your major donors. So just as with the board, we believe that personal engagement equals investment. And with your major donors, we see this happen most exclusively through the exchange of information. And that word exchange is important. You see here, we're noting some highlights of make it personal and regularly communicate with them, inform them, but make sure that this is a dialogue. You want to show to them that you want them to be among the first to know how important it was for you to personally reach out to see how they're doing, and if they have any questions about the organization's response to the current environment. So certainly sharing updates with them as you continue to build that relationship. But think about also, as I said, this is an exchange. So asking engaging questions. Your goal should be to build a dialogue with these individuals. It's not all just you sharing information, but it's you seeking information and feedback from them. So questions like, what do you think of our response? Or of our priorities during this time, what's most important to you? We love asking the question around whether they've participated in our digital content and what they found most engaging. And then also, as we all look to a hopeful return to purveying art throughout the community next year, asking what they're anticipating most. This can actually be a very helpful question for you to ask your major supporters as you're thinking about planning for the 2021 season and fiscal year. So one piece also to think about within stewardship, I know that many of you probably have donor benefits on the broad base as well as the major donor level. And there's a major question out there around how do we still fulfill donor benefits at a time where we can't physically interact? They're not coming into the concert hall, they're not coming into the museum or into our facilities. And so one thing that we want to highlight here, but throughout your donor benefits and your donor stewardship, is that you should drill down on translating what matters most to them about those benefits. And almost exclusively, it's about access. It's about their ability to have sneak peeks of the work you're doing, exclusive interactions with your artist. So thinking about how you might translate those kinds of access as a stewardship moment with major donors and your broad-based folks at this moment, translating that to smaller group interactions or virtual interactions. Wonderful. And so just as with the board, this work really is done one-on-one with the solicitation. Bob mentioned this earlier that, we really, especially at this time, want to move out of what we call passive solicitations. Letters and emails do serve a purpose in the overall organizational communication. But when it comes to asking those closest to our organization for their contributed revenue support, we want to think of them one by one, really developing a personalized asking plan for each one of our donors. And within that, communicating that they are one of a handful of people who can make the value proposition that you're sharing a reality. So I know, and Bob mentioned this a little bit as we got into the presentation this morning, but this is a group with which you are most likely to hear some hesitation or uncertainties about giving in this economic environment. And what we are finding most effective is to provide flexibility. So as Bob was saying, communicating that many donors are in that same boat, but so choosing to pledge now and either pay later this summer or installments over the coming months, and asking that great permission-based question that we love of, would that make you more comfortable? So seeking their feedback on options, providing options and seeking their feedback on those options, so you can, with them one by one, really navigate through what will get them to a yes most comfortably.
Kat, I'm gonna add one quick thing here, and this is not just for major gift individuals, but the idea that of why we're suggesting engaging personally with your donors. It's not just a tool to raise more money, and we never try to intimate that. But right now, and we know this from feedback, donors miss the organization. And this idea that when they come to a concert or they go to a performance or they go to, I mean, even if it's not performing arts, but there's, particularly in a performing arts environment, it is both a community event where you're sharing an experience with hundreds, if not more people who are hearing or watching the same thing that you are. And at the same time, it's so completely unique and intimate. And to not have that as a patron, whether they're telling you that or not, most often they're desperately missing it. And so, not that a phone call on occasion or sharing information or posting a video completely replaces that, because it doesn't. But the idea that we care enough about someone who cares enough about our organization that we want to stay in touch with them actually is extraordinarily helpful, particularly now. And so I just want to throw that in as sort of a blanket over all this kind of a conversation when we talk about the tools of reaching out and soliciting and so forth. I just want you to keep that in mind as well.
Great. Good. Let's jump on over to broad base. Great. So again, as with the board and as with our major donors, with our broad-based individual donors, communication is key, but the channel changes. It's a more efficient channel. So we're thinking email, social media, website, those things that Bob and I are talking about as organizational PR moments and your dissemination of the arts during this time. They also are part of that ongoing cultivation and stewardship of your broad base. And what we want to mention here too is we've seen an incredible response from the arts community really to transition how they disseminate the arts into a digital platform, and it's been incredible. And what we're finding that just as that volume of content continues, that the most successful organizations in continuing to engage their base through digital content are the ones that are asking their audience to participate with the content. So Bob's alluded to this as well, looking for surveys, looking for ways that your seminars or what you're putting out into the digital world is interactive. And most important here too is to, once you ask them to participate, to prove that you are listening. So this third bullet of ask for feedback and share the results. You need to show that the organization is listening and that you're using the call to action, essentially, that you are receiving from that feedback to shape your plans and to provide art. We'll also mention here that this is a great opportunity to activate your board and your artists or your musicians in the act of thanking. This is not just solid stewardship that we have mentioned is paramount now for patron and donor preservation, but it also is a wonderful training moment for volunteers or artists to become more involved in the act of fundraising. I have never encountered a client or an organization that felt like their board and their artists were fully activated in every way that they wish they could be in the act of fundraising. And one nice baby step towards that greater engagement can be asking them to be involved in thanking donors. So it's a wonderful training moment. You'll actually find, if you put this into action, that you're going to have some heroes emerge from this, or some leaders, some front leaders who really take to it. And those are the people that could actually be trained then further and coached further to become even more involved in the process of fundraising, even getting involved in the act of soliciting. So let's talk about the solicitation of our broad base. So as we've talked about, this message has to continue to be value-based. It's all circling around what your organization means to the donor and to the community at this time. And I'll drill down on that a little bit further. So that value proposition, almost universally, we're finding that it falls into one of three camps, or that your value pillars fall into one of three camps. They are what you are doing to continue to disseminate art at this time. So whether that's digitally, whether that is, in a public forum that is accessible, we're actually seeing plans for outdoor activities that allow for greater social distancing coming into place. The second is what you are continuing to do to support your musicians or your artists and the work that they do. So how you are essentially continuing to promote and provide art for your community through that investment in what is really your creative asset of your organization. And then third and final camp that value proposition falls within is just this idea of the organization's commitment to a triumphant return, whether that means a return to the stage, the concert hall, the museum, the classroom, the greater community, that what the work you are doing now to proactively plan and thoughtfully plan for how best to do so as we all reemerge from this situation. And one thing that we find as we disseminate that value-based message is that to close the gift, we need to do what we call create a sense of urgency. This is really motivating the donor to take action now rather than think about taking the action maybe at a later date. So answering the question of why give today. So you'll see on our fourth bullet point, we're using elements like challenge grants that can have specific deadlines, giving days. I know many of you probably participated in Giving Tuesday Now yesterday, but also immediate value and impact of their giving. So giving donors context through a timeline and using these tools like challenge grants or days of giving to help drive that. Great. So we want to talk a little bit about low cost and efficient gift appeals on the next slide. So really thinking about this in two camps. One camp being those simple, systematized, evergreen appeals that your organization can put into place. These are simple tactics like including a Give Now button on your website. Even as simple as including a Give Now button on every single e-blast. You'll be surprised at how many times we do not see that passive ask included on greater organizational communications. But those that do always see some action, even if the email or the communication itself is not fundraising based. So that idea that while we are talking to our patrons about our organizations, and while we are communicating and providing arts to them via digital platforms, that it's a wonderful opportunity to insert this passive ask, because it's when they're filled with the most joy and hope and information. It's when we're top of mind with them. The other approach that we're advising at this time on the broad base is really thinking about the phone. And we know that the phone is especially powerful, but right now people are even more accessible and hungrier for interaction than ever before. Before this time, we really looked at the efficiency or the effectiveness of appeals from an active and personal standpoint on that end of the spectrum, being personal face-to-face solicitations, all the way to passive solicitations that are, letter and email based. But what's interesting is right in the middle of those two, this idea of picking up the phone and reaching out to our donors, its efficiency and its effectiveness has exponentially increased just because of the nature of our situations. People are home, people are hungry for interaction, they're hungry for contact. So we're seeing the contact rates from phone calls exponentially increase during this time. And I know that many of you may not have a professional telefunding program. We're not advising that you go ahead and get that set up in the coming weeks, though it may be something that's part of your organization's planning and considerations. But even if you don't have a professional program, consider activating your board, your volunteers, and your artists in this process of reaching out. We've seen very effective virtual calling nights or, phone campaigns that are run over the course of 1 or 2 weeks, really just giving those volunteers simple tools and a focused period of time to reach out to this broader base of donors. Okay.
I'm gonna throw one thing in there too. I know we listed phone, and that's a great way of doing it, of course, with personal outreach. I've had questions about, what about Zoom, what about FaceTime, and listen, I'm pro all of that, every bit of it, provided that the person on each end is comfortable with that kind of technology. And so I lean into what's the donor, the prospect, how do they want to be contacted? And if it's phone, great. And if it's FaceTime, great. And if you don't know, then I would probably err on the side of less technology rather than more, because it just helps potential mistakes, eliminate or reduce those. So we say phone, but think about all levels of technology and who, either at the broad base or at the higher gift levels, might really be amenable to maybe a face-to-face, as it were, virtually so, but a face-to-face kind of contact too.
Absolutely. Good. All right, let's move on to institutional giving. So you'll see that there's a theme emerging here. We're telling you to reach out to your base and communicate proactively with them. And there is no different approach here with institutional. Absolutely continue the outreach. We're actually recommending that you're communicating updates and information and plans as they come forth at least once every 6 weeks with your major institutional donors. We're also recognizing that there will be additional inventory, sponsorable inventory that will be created from your creative solutions to what your 2021 seasons or fiscal years will look like. And so we're absolutely recommending that you capitalize on that new surface area. Really sit down and create that inventory of those activities that you expect to be engaged in over the next 12 to 18 months. So that can be everything from online offerings, patron offerings, and education and community offerings. So making sure that we look at the breadth of what the organization will be doing and then overlay the lens of how that work is fundable or sponsorable. Within our institutional donors, we do need to realize everybody is in recovery mode and things are changing rapidly. So there is no time like the present to be a true partner to your institutional donors. And what we mean by that is really working with them to solve problems, offer them more options, and be prepared to think creatively. So their review cycles may have changed, their criteria, their budget. Just be prepared to work within the new boundaries they have. I mentioned this exchange or dialogue of information when we were talking about cultivation and stewardship with our major individual donors. It is the exact same with our institutional donors. It's through that exchange that we actually build the relationship and help bring both the donor and the organization closer to that partnership that is the right fit at this moment for both. So this is another great place also to activate your board and your artists. So your board can certainly be ambassadors for hope and value of your organization at this time. And your artists can actually be providing value. So that might be, having musicians play at the corporate headquarters or play virtually to an employee base. So thinking about those ways that you can utilize those resources that you have at your fingertips to provide added value at this time. And most importantly, we say this all the time, thank the donor and then thank the donor. And oh yeah, don't forget to thank the donor. So even if you cancel or have to restructure something that a sponsor has supported, still thank them. Thank them even more so, especially if they are in a position where, as we'll talk about in a moment, they've converted their support to a more open or unrestricted gift to the organization. Okay. So let's talk about solicitation within our institutional giving segment. So what we absolutely advise is that you come to an agreement with your sponsor or your funder before you write the proposal. This is essentially exactly what we were talking about in the cultivation and the stewardship slide, that you will come to your solution based on a dialogue and through providing options and flexibility. That work should all be done before you put pen to paper around how they'll be supporting you in the upcoming season or fiscal year. So you, again, being that proactive partner, that dynamic partner with them to find the right fit in what we know will be an anomaly. We don't know exactly what 2021 will look like, but we know it won't look like it ever has before. And so being that partner with them, navigating through the changing environment. This is certainly a place, as we mentioned, to utilize your new inventory. So that's everything from your digital content, but it also might be thinking creatively. There are certainly going to be increased costs related to how we create a sterile and a healthy and a welcoming environment for our patrons moving into 2021. So there'll be support costs of cleaning or possibly screening procedures to ensure the health of our artists and our audience. So we're even saying that that might be a surface area moment or an opportunity to work with maybe a health provider or a medical center in your community to support those kinds of efforts. So get creative and think about all of the ways that your organization is adapting. And then for everything that you can no longer offer, what we like to say is, offer a choice of 2 yeses. So think about what can be done rather than can't. So that might sound like, we can't give you program book recognition, but what we can give you is online recognition for X or Y program. Which one would be the best fit for your mission? So it's not looking at what the organization cannot fulfill, but what the organization can fulfill, and positioning that in a way where they're making a choice between 2 yeses. Okay? And then let's talk a little bit just about our options for grantors. And so we know this is the segment where we have the most restrictions, or maybe another way to say that is the giving is most directed. So on a case-by-case basis, you should evaluate those grantors and be confident, and most importantly, have the conversation. So just as we are saying with institutional and individual donors, that with our grantors, we should proactively reach out. This is still relationship-based fundraising. And what we're finding across the country is that most grantors are willing to work with you. We're actually seeing a trend of grantors and foundations, both private foundations and corporate foundations, relaxing restrictions. So be proactive and have the conversation with them. Be assumptive that they'll actually lift the restriction. And what we know is they're still in a position where, to fulfill their mission, they have to disseminate the money. So let's help them think and be thoughtful and creative about how their partnership with your organization can continue even during this time of upheaval. Okay.
What I'll say about institutional giving, to underscore what Kat was saying, it's amazing right now the level of flexibility that businesses and grantors, institutional grantors, are making right now. And one of the places where we've seen very early success, for instance, is if there was a performance or a concert or something like that that was canceled that we had a sponsor for, flipping that gift over into a challenge grant for the current year. So when we talk about how can you keep the money this year, flipping that into a challenge grant where you say, listen, we're going to put you in every communication. We'll put you on the website. We're going to say your name 1,000 times to every one of our donors we talk to. You know, that kind of idea where you can still be very creative, give them lots of exposure, make them look like a hero in the process is very, very useful for everyone and deeply appreciated in most cases by the institutional donors. So again, have some fun with it, be creative, think about the things you can actually deliver and put that together and then begin to have the conversations with your sponsors about it. Because and your institutional donors, they're usually looking for ways to continue to help you, not the converse. So moving into the next 18 months or so, we don't know, again, if there's a cap on this in 18 or 24 months or what that looks like precisely. But what we're recommending right now is that each organization, particularly in the performing arts, prepares 3 organizational plans. And those plans would be similar in terms of focus, but they would have different start times. And so we think about it in terms of a performing arts institution and what they might deem as a regular season. Is it even feasible at this point to launch a regular season? In some cases, 2 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, it seemed possible. 2 weeks ago, everyone was shaking their heads saying, no, it's absolutely going to be February or maybe beyond. Now that things are starting to open back up, there's some places who are talking about maybe we could do September, October. So again, those vacillate. And so what we're recommending is, rather than trying to be reactive every time conditions begin to change, instead create 3 plans, and they each have a different start date. So you could have one that for us, we're playing with the idea of a holiday launch, then maybe a winter launch or a spring launch, and then into the next fall season. But these are only examples. And so if the context for your institution is, well, we might actually think about a September, October launch. And if that doesn't work, then a holiday launch. And if that doesn't work, then a winter launch. It's all okay. But we'll take you through our examples and you contextualize them for your own organization. So we say, prepare 3 operational organizational plans that have different start dates that allow you to continue to present your programs and services in the way that you can within those condensed time frames. And for each one of those, create a marketing plan, which we won't talk about in any detail today, but how do you market whatever it is that you're going to be doing, and how do different launch times affect your ability to market and message and communication frequency, that sort of thing. And then we talk about preparing three fundraising plans. And again, they'll look very similar, but they'll be different enough. And that's really what I'm going to help take you through here, just for our final phase before we go into Q&A. But this idea of what would a fundraising plan look like. And so if we prepare these, here's what we can say. In every case, we can focus on donor generosity. It's actually a constant, and there's evidence of this. Even though I know a global pandemic is different from anything else, if we look back at 2006, 2007, and 2008, when things shook apart financially, yes, giving took a dip. It came right back up, and it continued on a constant moving forward. People want to be generous, though. They want to feel like they're making a difference. They want to feel like they're adding value. And organizations should do the same thing. So in every one of these plans, we focus on the potential for donor generosity. We focus ourselves on the value message that we can create. Even if we don't know with precision what it is we're going to be able to offer, we can take each one of these plans and predict, based on a launch time, what we can do versus what we can't. Focus on those things that we can do. And again, knowing your numbers, your timelines, your activities for each of the operational plans, then flipping that into the fundraising plan so that you know launch times, sponsorship opportunities, exposure, number of, reach, number of touches, that kind of thing on the presentation side, and then reflecting that back for sponsorships and donations. Sometimes we know in some organizations, sponsorships are even from individual donors or from family foundations. All that's okay. It all applies in the same way. But having those different start dates and how your fundraising plan will look allows you to know how to approach those donors, when, how, and with what sort of value-based message. We talk about doing the high leverage, high return gifts first to build momentum. that's one of our standard approaches anyway, even in the best of times, is to know that those who are most generous to you are likely going to continue to be the most generous to you. And so the approaching them first and approaching them fully and working with them to get their commitment is usually a very big plus and helps build momentum for your operation. And so the work that you're putting in the early stages has maximum results for you. We look so plan number one would be the holiday, what we're calling in our context, the holiday 2020 launch. So these are some points to think about. We front load leadership giving, and that would be board, and if you have trustees, if you have other volunteers, fantastic. If you have other leadership, non-board donors, so your major gifts, your sponsorships, and then any what we're calling heroic giving. Heroic giving for us means that while your institution is not able to generate earned revenue through ticket sales or events or whatever, or memberships or whatever you might have, heroic giving is what's going to be done by a handful of donors, 6, maybe 10 donors at the top, who are going to provide enough added cash for the institution that would get you through, let's say, December of this year. And so even if you're on an on-time launch, you have a summer lull, and to look at heroic giving that gets you into fiscal Q1 and fiscal Q2. We say, for the meantime, curb high cost, low yield asking until the election's over. There's a lot of reasons for that, but not the least of which is there's going to be a lot of noise. It's a national election. It's going to be a contentious election. Doesn't matter what side you're on. It's going to be very contentious. It's going to create a lot of noise. And so for us to try to add one more letter to an already exploding mailbox of letters and requests and information and politics is probably not going to be getting a lot of attention. So we're saying just wait till right after that's over and then put your information out. Increasing communication in terms of -8 weeks before the launch. So if you're going to do a holiday launch in this effort, you might start really beginning to heavily communicate come October, preparing people for the season and when it's going to launch and what it's going to be and what performances and what services you're going to continue to offer. So think about what that would look like T-8 weeks out of just beginning to communicate prior to your launch. And then we say produce and share music and art, whatever it is, produce all those things online, continue to promote the confidence and the value of your organization. As music and art and things become, live performances come back on stage, building confidence that your organization's ready, that your performance space is ready, and that what you're offering is going to be of high value, that everyone's used to and what they're accustomed to and what they enjoy. That level of confidence will go a long way in thinking about how to carve that pathway through your first fundraising plan will be essential. The next plan is what we're, for us in this scenario, is a spring, summer 2021 launch. So actually waiting until the next calendar year. Again, we front load leadership giving, board giving, sponsorship giving. We might look more at multi-year giving just because now our fiscal year is condensed. And so getting a single commitment that goes for this current fiscal year and into next fiscal year is quite often a benefit, again, just because the calendar's gotten tightened up. And looking at fiscal Q1 and Q2 as much as you can. Again, we curb the high cost, low yield, but this time until performances resume or your concerts resume. And so again, once you're publicly back, you're preparing to resume semi-normal operations. That's when we say think about the solicitation activities that might be a little bit lower yield and a little bit higher cost, but are still essential. I mean, you still want to continue to have these people be involved. They want to give, and we want to offer them opportunities to give. And then again, this is -8 weeks out before the launch of whatever your season or performance schedule looks like. That's when we begin to ramp up the communications again, of inform, and be very interactive. Then we say produce and share your art online, promote confidence and value. That never goes away, really. So the number 3 is, what if you had to miss a whole year? What does that look like? And we'll say, well, then plan and schedule is traditional and you just missed a year, and most folks will understand that hasn't been in your control, and you've taken all this year, the entire year, to stay in contact with them, to post whatever you can online and have them participate, ask for their opinions, do all this great stuff that we've talked about, and then increasing the communication over the summer to prepare. It would feel like a normal season if you just missed a year. So whatever your normal communication plan looks like, really lean into it going into the new season. And again, you front load your leadership, your heroic asking into fiscal Q1 and Q2. It's very likely that if you know that you're going to do a fall 21 launch, you've already done your sponsorship giving at that point. And the other thing that we always caution is, if you're looking at that, be ready for mid-fiscal year changes. If you get into January and suddenly it looks like you're not gonna, or March, and it looks like you're not gonna have a fall launch, just be ready to make those adjustments. Conversely, if all of a sudden there's opportunity to launch a semi-season much sooner, also be ready for that. And so the third fundraising plan has to offer quite a bit of flexibility on the back end to be reactive as things continue to change for you. So I know that was a lot to absorb. We're happy to take some questions now. We've got about 20 minutes or so left, and then we've got one other thing to show you when we're done. But let's open it up and do the Q&A if we have a list there that we can be responsive to.
Well, so far nobody's typed in any questions. If anybody has trouble finding the chat box, there's an icon, a chat icon in the middle of the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. If you click that, there's a place to type in your questions if you have any. And I'm not, you two are very thorough apparently. Okay, here's one. Yes, with Premier Individual Giving, my question is vehicle, phone call, direct mail, letter. So they're somewhat confused, it sounds like, as to which is the best vehicle for Premier Giving.
Right. Good. So I'll take this one, Kat. Jump in if you'd like. Of course, to me, it personal interaction is always best, and there's a lot of reasons for it. But some of the most important reasons are A, it yields better results in giving. Two, because we're not out there performing and interacting, that our patrons, stated or not stated, desire some sort of interaction from us. And so reaching out to them, even if to make an ask, is the best thing. So generally what we'll say is, if you're going to start with anything, start with a phone call. If you're not sure if it's the right time to ask them, it's okay. We do what we'll, in some cases, on the stewardship calls, when we're just filling in information, updating them, telling them, we'll do sometimes what we call a qualifying ask. And I'll give you an example to put it in context. So if I'm calling and I say, listen, I want to update you on what we're doing in the organization. Here's some great stuff. Here's what we're posting online. Have you been able to click on and partake in it and watch it? And what do you think? And you have that kind of nice conversation. Part of what you can do at the end of it is say, listen, we're, because we're not doing our performances right now, having those, and because we're not having ticket money come in, one of the things that we might be doing at the end of the fiscal year is coming back to some of our very best friends and asking them to make another contribution, or to make next year's gift a little earlier than they normally would. And I just want to know that when that time comes, would it be okay for me to reach out to you again? That's a qualifying, so you're not making the ask, you're asking for permission to make the ask. And if they say no, that's okay. There's no shaming, no crying in fundraising, so it's all right. And we say it's fine. We love how much they take care of the institution. We love that they're part of it, and we move on. If they say yes, though, then we can just say, well, that's terrific. We really appreciate that. It'll likely be in the next 6 to 8 weeks when I call you. Would that be okay? Fantastic. And then you have to keep records, obviously. But it's a nice, soft way to qualify somebody if you're going to ask them to do more or ask them to do something differently. And you can't really do that in a letter. I mean, you can, but it's one way. And if someone really blanches at that sort of approach, you're never really going to know it until they just stop giving. So I like the interactivity. I like to be able to gauge how they're feeling about it, address their concerns personally. So anyway, those are a couple of the reasons why I like to step off first with a phone call.
Mhm.
Okay, great. Here's an interesting question. It's kind of a couple of people have asked this. Basically, when all of the other nonprofits in the area are hitting up the same donor base with basic needs for food, shelter, medical care, and those kinds of things, what can performing arts organizations offer, and how can you frame that as? What can they offer that no one else can, especially when you're up against these health and human services organizations?
Right. Kat, do you?
Oh, you broke up a little bit there, Bob, but I'll jump in. And so one of the things that we are recommending, and it's back to that idea of value-based fundraising rather than needs-based fundraising. In this environment, if we get into needs-based, we're going to lose as compared to what is perceived as the imminent need of food, shelter, basic needs. And so what we're advising is that your case, the message that you give to them, is based on your value rather than your need at this time. So don't even get into the game with them, because we will lose. I will take you back to those 3 categories of value proposition that I mentioned. And we are in a unique position to be those purveyors of hope to, through the arts, uplift people. So think about those 3 categories in that context. How you are still providing art to your community at this time, how you are still supporting your creative asset, your artists, your musicians, and how you are working towards a triumphant return back to the community, whether that's on the stage, whether that's in classrooms, whether that's in the museum. And so those are the 3 value points, or rather the categories to explore as you develop your own personalized case for support. So we don't get in the needs competition with our health and human service friends. We lean into what we can uniquely and what only we as arts organizations can provide as far as value to that individual patron, to that corporate or institutional partner, and to the community as a whole.
Yeah, I agree with that. What I would add is that if we present, if you as an arts organization, if you present yourself as an entertainment option, you'll lose that argument, because we're talking about basic human essential needs. And we don't want to compete with that, because there's no competition. That I think we would all agree that feeding, clothing, and housing people who need it at a desperate time is important. So why go there? The idea, though, is that as I think, as Kat said, part of the gauge of a recovering community is the arts organizations within it, and what those arts organizations are able to provide. So it's not just about entertainment. It's not just about when concerts come back or performances come back and people applaud. This is about when we get back into schools, when we have some influence on teachers, when we have some influence on students, when we're back adding to the quality of life for people who are in nursing homes, and partnerships that we have with other organizations who quite often are connected to health and human services. Those are real. Those are way beyond any scope of just pure entertainment. And while we don't want it to look like, what we do for health and human services is better than what somebody else does, it is very unique in how we present it, and quite essential. And so that's why we would ask our donors and shareholders to continue to support at really their most generous level possible.
Okay, and I'm kind of combining 2 questions into one here.
Yeah.
Which fundraising strategies have the highest yield right now? And then someone else asked, would this be a good time to test a crowdfunding site like Patreon?
To the second question, no. And it would be my quick response. And the reason is because it's not that personal. B, the most, at least what I've seen, the most productive use of crowd fundraising has been in an emergency situation. So it's almost always needs based, and so it's pretty counter to what we're talking about of a values message. Sometimes if you couple it with a challenge grant, that'll work. But it's a little too arm's length for us in terms of that, trying to generate business there. To me, the most effective thing is you continue to do personal outreach as much as you can. If you can activate your board to do pure stewardship, where they're just calling every single person who made a gift, every single company, at every level. I don't care if it's a $10 gift. It really doesn't matter. Just call somebody and thank them. It goes a long way, and there's evidence that shows that now too, of what the return rate looks like for people who've been almost immediately thanked for their gift of support. And if it's a personal thank you, not a letter, that someone does. So we're all into the highest, most productive right now is to do personal outreach, personal asks, because it provides what the other methods don't, which is real true interaction, flexibility, engagement. And right now, particularly now when you're not up and running at full speed, those are things that actually have an increased amount of value attached to them.
Okay, and this is kind of a follow-up in some ways. How important is timing for launching a fundraising during a crisis? Can we expect a low in individual giving as we enter crisis recovery over the next few months?
I can respond to that. It's we really don't know. I mean, if you look at what happened in 07 and 08, there was a dip in individual giving, but it was momentary. Right now, I think people are starting to feel the optimism again. States are starting to loosen up. The plans are starting to come together. I mean, it's certainly not carefree by any imagination, but sentiment's starting to change. I'm always of the school of ask early, ask often, and waiting. Well, here's what we don't know what's going to happen. And we could play. I'm not a fear monger at all, but you could predict that there would be another spike in the coronavirus, and that could temporarily make everyone back off again. So I say go ahead and move forward with it. Do as much qualifying as you can so that it doesn't feel and shouldn't feel like you're just hammering donors, give now, give now, give now. But this idea is if you're positioning a value proposition, you have good leverage, you've created a challenge grant, you have good conversations, it's relationship based, there's no reason not to begin to go out and solicit and to have those conversations. And if a donor says no right now, the likelihood is that it's going to be no, not right now, instead of just no, please go away. And so that's why I think, err on the side of asking is a pretty good policy in most instances.
Yeah. And I'll go back to that proof point that I mentioned during the presentation, the sense of hesitation over whether it's a good time or not right now. The greatest proof that we have are in the results of those groups we've been working with that have proceeded. And as I mentioned, these are groups with varying different size budgets and very different communities, but all as they're moving forward are seeing success. We're seeing $10, $40, $100,000 days for organizations who are proceeding now, and we're proceeding with this work over the month of April, which you could assume is one of the greatest months of uncertainty and panic that we will see, just because it was one of the first major months of this pandemic. So proof is always in the results as far as knowing whether we are appropriately moving forward.
Okay, there's a question here about creating your different plans. This person asks, how much detail would you build into a plan 3, knowing that flexibility and ability to pivot is key for that longest term plan?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would give it as much detail as you can, with the idea that taking more than, we're looking at it as an extreme. Taking more than a year off will be a travesty to most institutions. And it'll be devastating to them financially unless we continue to have fundraising moving forward. The part where you might have to be more flexible is that if suddenly the lights turn green and the sky's blue and you got to go, and you didn't, and you weren't ready for that contingency, that things actually get better faster than you anticipated, and you want to remount the season or partial season or and so that one's a little harder to anticipate. What I would say though is if you know that 8 to 12 weeks out, you can begin to readjust that plan. I wouldn't just keep on keeping on a shortened plan and then the situation improves and you try to continue to push through that plan. The things you'll want to change up are things like sponsorship schedules and major gifts schedules. And then you might actually take some of these lower leverage but higher cost activities and rotate them back on faster. So I think that in my mind, the contingency is more about what happens if the news is good and we need to be responsive to that.
Good. Christine, I pulled up the chat and actually see kind of a follow-up question to one that we addressed a couple of questions ago of how would you differentiate between value and benefits? So I did just want to address that. We really believe that donors give to organizations for one of three reasons. It's what it does for the organization, it's what it does for the community, or it's what it does for the individual donor. And when we think about benefits, that's where we typically fall in that third camp of a quid pro quo for giving, and then therefore what the organization will do for the donor. So what you get for giving. And what we're saying in this environment is that from the messaging standpoint, that you really lean more heavily on the first and the second camp of what their giving does for the organization and what it does for the community. Most importantly, because you may be in a position where you can't fully fulfill what your traditional benefits are.
That's great. Yeah. And there's also another question here from a brand new community theater who has just launched. He says, we have no real base yet, and we're just starting to come up with an ask. How do you suggest that we begin to build a base of supporters in this current environment?
Oh, I love it. It's great because we did some pro bono work last year with a local. I'm in Indianapolis, Indiana, and we had a local theater who just started. I mean, it was so much fun just to help them. So we've got a little bit of background. What we recommend on particularly in this sort of thing is to go deep and not necessarily wide. If you can think about the kind of funders who are local and who support theater, and potentially come up with a name of, let's say, 25 or 30 people, which might sound like a lot, and it is when you're first getting started. Later, it's nothing compared to building a donor base. But right now, you got to really focus on, what do we have to work with and who can we go to? So I always start with affinity on that. And if you can look at other organization and their donor lists through their program books or their online recognition, or, sometimes oddly enough, talking to the community foundation and seeing what kind of funders or family foundations that are available. So I tend to say, let's not work fast on broadening the base. Let's first work on getting a handful of donors who are really going to be our caretakers for the first couple of years. And we take time to share our vision, the purpose of why we came, why did we build this organization? Why is it different from others? What value do we add? And look at that. And sometimes those people even turn into potential board members if you have your nonprofit status. Mm-hmm. And so there's really, there's some really good byproducts that come from it too. They can also help be your audience builders. So I look at the people who have an affinity and an affection for the kind of work that you do, but may not know who you are. They could put $1,000 in or $5,000 in, and for you that'd be like getting $50,000. It's a huge win. And so that's why I kind of look at going in that direction rather than trying to build a broad base and then figuring out who could maybe increase over time and going that route. You need to get velocity very quickly, and focusing on a few people who really care about you and would support that for a while is a pretty good place to start.
Great, that's great. And then somebody else kind of gave a follow-up question to that. It says, we have a small organization for music education program, staff of 3. How would you recommend fundraising, prioritizing, and planning with, and I guess that really with that small staff, how are they going to find the manpower for that? I think is what the question is really saying.
Yeah, Kat, do you want to chime in on that one?
Sure. So we really think about, in an organization that might be an organization, a staff of 3, and I'm assuming that this organization doesn't have one of those 3 individuals dedicated in part or wholly to fundraising. Really, then it's the executive leadership. We see them as taking on the major role of guiding the fundraising program, keeping the trains of the fundraising program running on time. But it's an especially important organization to engage your board. You're going to need those volunteer hands on the wheel to conduct the work. So they're under the direction of the executive director, but they are helping you conduct that outreach, whether it's cultivation, solicitation, or stewardship. You're just going to need more bodies that you can deploy. And the first place you should be looking for those are to your board members.
Yeah, and the only thing I'll add is if you sort of turn the mirror the other way and look at your donors, and you're trying to prioritize who to talk to, I mean, again, it depends on what your donor base looks like, what the size of it is, but we often talk about top 10, top 20, and that's usually in terms of who either gives at the highest levels or who's been giving the longest. You can define that any way you'd like to, really, as long as you're consistent over time. But that way, that with limited time, and you can categorize who you should reach out to first based on that limited time. So there's sort of little just tools like that you can use to help manage a small staff and a growing donor base.
And I think we've pretty much covered everything that's here in the questions. Anybody else have a last minute question they want to type in for the last couple of minutes of the webinar?
And if not, I'll go to our final slide.
Oh, sure.
Okay, so we'll go here. Again, this is, we want this webinar to be helpful. This is not, today is not a sales pitch for you. This is something we feel very strongly about. But we also started receiving requests early on about, is there some way for organizations to engage with RSC? So for a brief time. So we put something together for you. I just want to briefly share it. We have a virtual fundraising coach program that's available. It's a 3-month program. It's 8 hours each month of personalized coaching time, either scheduled via web meetings and phone calls or on demand as you need it. If you pick up the phone, send us an email. It's $2,000 a month. So if you pay for 2 months up front, you get the 3rd month for free. So it's $4,000 total for 3 months. Which is, really, at least in our world, a pretty reasonable way to approach it. And we have a money back promise. If after following our coaching for 3 months, your organization doesn't at minimum raise $4,000 in new money, we'll give you the money back. We'll give you your feedback. So it's really a no risk for you. We're trying every way that we can to be helpful. And so if you have any interest in it, you can reach out to us. There's our email address is at the bottom of this, rsc@rscfundraising.com. If we can help you, we'd love to, and we'll go from there. So thank you for that couple of minutes.
Okay, great. And we're just getting, haven't gotten any more further questions. We're just getting a lot of thank yous. And I'm sure is Nate still here?
I want to add to that thank you. Thanks, Christine, for managing all the questions, and Bob and Kat, thank you so much for this incredible opportunity and all of this amazing information. It's been very helpful to me, certainly, and I know a lot of other folks out there. And then this webinar is going to be on our training videos and resources page at artsnc.org, hopefully in the next 24 to 48 hours. So be sure to send other folks in your networks to that video so that they can take advantage of this as well.
Great. Thank you, everyone. We really appreciate your time and participation. Good questions on this too. Thank you.
Thank you all. It's been a pleasure. And very fun to see some familiar names on the list as well. So to all my friends out there, hello.
Okay.